Hello, and welcome to the Formal Review. Today, we'll be having a very special episode, looking at 4 different movies. Now sit back, relax, grab your drinks, and let's talk about these movies.
What's up, y'all, and welcome back to the Formal Review. This is Season 4, Episode 32, and I thank you all for tuning in once again. Welcome to the 4th episode in the award season series, as we are now in a award season, and there's still a lot of films to be seen. So every year, if you haven't been following, I watch all the films that have been nominated for Best Picture, Best Director, and then all the acting categories. And then sometimes I also watch the screenplay films if I have time, or if there's only 1 or 2 that I haven't seen yet. This is the case this year, and I will be doing that, and I'll be covering everything in the next episode and going over all of that. Now that all of the films were nominated toward the end of February, there was still a lot of films that I hadn't seen yet. Now, between that and the Oscar ceremony, there's only about a month to go through all of those films, so we had to increase the amount of films covered in each episode. Now, in the first episode in this series, I covered Don't Look Up, King Richard, and Drive My Car. In the second, I went into Belfast, Licorice Pizza, and Coda. And in the last episode, I went to Eyes of Tammy Faye, Being the Ricardos, Spencer, and Dune. And then, again in this episode, I will be going into 4 films: The Lost Daughter, The Worst Person in the World, Parallel Mothers, and finally, West Side Story. So stay tuned. Have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? When I was trying to get this podcast off the ground, I had a lot of questions, like how do I record an episode? How do I get my show into all the apps that people like to listen on? How do I make money from my podcast? The answer to every single one of those questions is really simple. Anchor. Anchor is a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing my podcast. And best of all, it's absolutely 100% free and ridiculously easy to use. And now Anchor can match you with some great sponsors. That means you can get paid to podcast right away. In fact, that's exactly what I'm doing right now. So if you've always wanted to start a podcast and make money doing it, go to anchor.fm/start to join me and the diverse community of podcasters already using Anchor. Again, that's anchor.fm/start. And I can't wait to hear your podcast. Now, before I get into anything, I do want to preface this episode with a slight spoiler warning for these films. To go into a full analysis of some of them, there may be some spoilers. As I always say, go see the film first before you have to hear what I have to say about it, so you fully understand everything. Also, I know I talk about this at the end, but the data shows that most people don't listen to that part, so I want to talk about it here and reiterate the importance of leaving reviews on your favorite subscription services. I do read those because I do want to grow, because these episodes are really for all you listeners out there, and I want to keep this entertaining. So what do you want to hear? Do you want to hear games? Do you want to hear more of the 4K stuff? Do you want to hear me talk about a certain movie? If you want to come on and talk to me about something, if you want to debate, I'm always open to do stuff like that, so you can always reach out to me on social media. I always want to grow and improve, and
just because something works doesn't mean that it cannot be improved.
So if there's something that you want me to improve on, let me know, and I will grow as such. And if you want to skip ahead, if you don't care about certain films, you can skip ahead to certain time points in this episode so that you listen to the films that you want to hear me talk about. If you want to hear the analysis on The Lost Daughter, go to the approximate 3-minute mark. If you want to hear the analysis on The Worst Person in the World, go to the 7.5-minute mark. And if you want to go hear the analysis on Parallel Mothers, go to the 12-minute mark. And then finally, if you want to hear the analysis for West Side Story, go to the 15-minute mark. Anyway, now that we've gone all through that, let's get on to the final 4 films in the award season series. So let's sit back, relax, grab your drinks, and let's talk about these movies. The Lost Daughter is a psychological drama film written and directed by Maggie Gyllenhaal in her feature directional debut. It is based on the 2006 novel of the same name by Elena Ferrante, and it stars Olivia Colman, Dakota Johnson, Jessie Buckley, Paul Mescal, Dagmara Dominczek, Jack Farthing, Oliver Jackson Cohen, Peter Sarsgaard, and Ed Harris. Now, this film tries to unfold the fairly complicated intricacy of being a mother. Now, as obviously I am not a mother, take my word on what that means with a huge huge grain of salt. My thoughts on this topic are obviously fairly limited, and if I'm wrong about something, feel free to reach out and tell me later on. But the main character of this film is Lita, who's played by Coleman. She's a professor who is someone who's had issues balancing the ideas of what makes a bad versus what makes a good mother. This film shows that while she does not regret motherhood, she does feel that she's lost a part of her identity as an independent human being. During her vacation to Greece, she runs into this mother-daughter who reminds her of her days as a young mother. Now, as a character, Lita here is this voyeur for the audience, as we're seeing her being her own person, but this is stopped when she's spoken to, and this basically puts her down a journey that she may not have expected, which aligns with her experiences with her daughters. She goes down this memory lane, but eventually the pleasant memories become replaced by those that are troubling. So as a young mother and scholar, she struggles to manage her academic interest and also her daughters. The relationship between them are started to strain as Lita somewhat starts to lose a part of herself. As such, she turns into this furious mother that was essentially trapped in her mind. Then, like Elena, who disappears in present time, Lita loses the connection that she has with her daughters. Now, there's even more complexities in Lita and her interaction with Elena's doll. In the scene prior to Elena disappearing, the audience learns that it was Lita who stole it from Elena. Now, the question is why? And this is almost because she had this doll as a child that was her favorite, but when she gave it to her own daughter, her daughter destroyed it. So, when Lita comes across the doll, she wants to keep it for herself instead of giving it back to Lita. And this emulates basically her destructive relationship that would lead to the current relationship that she feels that she has with her daughter. But in her past, after having that kind of tragic relationship with her daughter, she progresses individually as she then starts prioritizing her own interests and growth of herself. This then leads her to having an extramarital affair with further distances herself from her children, and then she leaves her husband with the daughters for 3 years. Now, in the film, she describes this separation as amazing, but it's also a reason for guilt. She then tries to give knowledge to Nina, who is the mother of Elena, because she sees a lot of herself in her. Now, I'm not going to go into the exact examples here, but she tries to pass on this knowledge so that Nina doesn't go down the same path that Lita goes down. And so eventually Lita ends up leaving Greece, but then her car breaks down and she falls asleep on the beach. And the next day she calls her daughters, who weirdly show their love and affection to her completely without any hesitation. And this scene is pretty powerful because it's based on a discussion of what a navel is, which is obviously the final physical connection that a baby has with their mother. This film has a really great performance by Coleman, and it's extremely layered with meanings and symbols. And the cinematography really does a great job creating this sense of intimacy and closeness between some of these characters. And once the film ended, it was a very profound story to experience and look back upon, but it was a long one. The film's first act is fairly hard to get through, but once it does offer a fairly decent and intense character study of what I would say is theoretical ugly side of motherhood. And essentially, the director here basically sacrificing this pacing for giving these multifaceted characters, which then reveal the inner turmoils of Lita. The film eventually succeeds with its story, its themes, and its ending, and its characters. It only struggles with its details such as its pacing, and it's not one that I would want to revisit anytime soon. However, if you really liked it, I could see how you would. 4 out of 5. Now on to the next film. Now, the worst person in the world, or in Norwegian, Verdens verste menneske, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, is a dark romantic comedy drama film directed by Joachim Trier. It is apparently the third film in his Oslo trilogy, following 2006's Reprise and 2011's Oslo 31 August. Now, I haven't seen either of these, so I can't really comment on their sequence within that trilogy. But this film stars Renate Reinsve, Anders Dan Lee, and Herbert Nordrum. So the film's protagonist is Julie, who's basically never committed to one thing in her entire life. As a teenager, she was an overachiever and then even dabbled in medicine before realizing that she was more interested in things such as the soul of the body instead of the anatomy of it. So she shifts to photography, but then that manages to bore her as well. And then soon enough, she's off to the next thing. The film then attempts to show small elements in her life as she aims for self-actualization, and each moment is different, some lasting only a few minutes and others lasting fairly decent miniseries. This aligns really with Julie's view on life and how things change quickly or they can only change after a while. Her life is fairly sporadic, but eventually the audience sees that she eventually ends up in a long-term relationship with a much older graphic novelist named Axel, whose career basically gives her a stability to work at a bookstore while also looking for the next thing that excites her. She eventually manages to establish herself as a gifted writer, but as with everything else that we've seen up to this point, she's not really committed to that. And even she gets to a point where her relationship with Axel is too stable for her. He has an idea to have a family and kids, and she's more on the maybe or someday mindset. And then she sees Axel being more loved by comic book fanboys, and that kind of isolates her a bit because she sees the benefit of being so successful in one avenue. And then she meets Eivind, who she spends a non-sexual night with. In short, they try to show how intimate they can be with each other without actually cheating on each other's respective partners. However, this still gives them a feeling that may actually be worse than physically cheating. And so this coming-age story is one that we've seen before, with an almost adult searching for some sense of direction and then eager to get more from life than what others expect from them. Now, Rensfe as Julie is fantastic. She allows the character to be very gentle, sharp, but also nervous at the same time. Her character knows that life is short, and she never wants to feel that she's wasting her years away on one thing without trying something else. However, again, she sees that there's some benefit to firmly committing to one thing, as shown by Axel's character. Now, the core theme of this film is that in life, people are figuring things out, and this is a key part of living, and to evolve from those things is the essence of being alive. Thus, the title of the film feels off because the words are actually said by Eivind when he begins to drift from his girlfriend to say something along the lines of individuality makes you the worst person in the world. However, this is still based on the idea of cheating, so that in itself becomes questionable. Additionally, the film does feel slow at times, but it does help the film keep the situations feeling more realistic. The film really wants its audience to feel what it's like having second thoughts and then taking time to enjoy the moments while in them. Otherwise, though, this film is about a woman trying to figure out herself, her relationships, and her career, but mostly what's best for her. It does take a very slow but deep dive into a character, and it really does show that it's no longer the norm for adults in their 20s or 30s even to have everything figured out. You don't need to have a spouse, a career, or a bunch of children at this point in life. Because of science, we're allowed to have more time in life and try to be who we want to be. But even so, there's more pressure to do that as well. And this is a complicated discussion to have, at least. So the film really does succeed with its story, its characters, and its direction, but does struggle a little bit with its themes and its details. 4 out of 5. Now let's get on to the next film. Hello Mothers, or in Spanish, Madres Paralelas, is a drama film directed by Pedro Almodovar, and it stars Penelope Cruz, Milena Smith, and also Aitana Sanchez Hichon, Israel Alejandre, Julieta Serrano, and Jose de Palma. The film concentrates mostly on Janice, who's played by Cruz, who is a professional photographer in her 40s who starts this casual relationship with a forensic anthropologist, Arturo. Now fast forward 9 months and she's preparing to give birth and raise her child as a single mother. Now, her roommate is in a fairly similar position to her, but she's over 20 years younger. These two women basically form a bond and then keep in touch with each other after the birth of their daughters. Now, this film then progresses to be a fairly straightforward film showing the perils of parenthood, but specifically looking at women who raise children outside of the confines of the conventional ideals, aka the heterosexual couple. This film also then shows generational contrast between Janice and Anna. For example, Janice is pursuing trying to get her great-grandfather's exhumation, but Anna rudely dismisses this as obsessive in nature. Then Janice explains that the war hasn't truly ended if atrocities go unaccounted for. Now, this is something because she was raised by her grandmother, who saw all of Franco's cruelties and recalled everything that went on. But Janice's own mother was a quote-unquote hippie who took advantages of the creative renaissance after Franco's death. And then conversely, Anna was raised by a quote apolitical actress mother and wasn't really keen on anything happening in the past. And it really dives into the idea of that Winston Churchill phrase of those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Now, looking into Almodovar as a director, I've only seen one of his films, Pain and Glory, from a few years ago. But from the look of it, none of them really have shown the effects of the Spanish Civil War. So this film almost acts as an atonement for him from distancing himself from the effects of the Civil War. Because Pain and Glory was essentially his semi-autobiographical film. So seeing him trying to atone for avoiding this topic because of the impact that it had on the Spanish people, it's a really valid attempt by him. His film remains fairly sensitive pretty much the entire film, and that's really paired with an amazing performance by Cruz. And she plays this woman whose life endures the legacy left by the trauma of her family's past. And she wants to pass on the stories that her grandmother left to her so that younger generations will know what people went through. And this film is really a great example of that Churchill phrase and why it's important to remember things that we have forgotten. It succeeds with its direction, its themes, its story, its characters, but struggles a little bit with its pacing that make it really difficult to really want a second viewing, though it wasn't a wasted time for me, and I honestly wouldn't hesitate to watch it again if somebody really wanted to, but I won't go out of my way to. 4.5 out of 5. Now let's get on to the final film in this award season series, West Side Story. West Side Story is a musical romantic drama film directed and co-produced by Steven Spielberg from a screenplay by Tony Kushner. It is the second feature-length adaptation of the 1957 stage musical of the same name. It stars Ansel Elgort and Rachel Zegler, with co-stars Ariana DeBose, David Alvarez, Mike Faist, and Rita Moreno joining them along. Now let's be frank here. If you've seen the original or Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, you know the story. The film is set around 1960 in San Juan Hill and Lincoln Square, and the neighborhood is having ethnic tensions between the neighborhood's white and Puerto Rican residents. Again, the story for the most part is exactly the same as the original. Now I know to compare the originals to remakes is almost a fool's errand, but when the changes are minimal, it's hard not to. And to be fair, this new rendition has really amazing performances by DeBose and Zegler as Anita and Maria respectively. Zegler's singing is perhaps the best on screen throughout the entire film, and DeBose steals every single scene when she's on. She is absolutely fantastic as Anita and is well worth her Oscar nomination for the character. If you watch the film as an Anita and Maria story, there's plenty to love. The New America sequence is perhaps one of my favorite changes that they made to this story. They made it a more charismatic sequence and basically showing how the entire neighborhood is connected to this, and while also showing the relationship between Anita and Bernardo, and their chemistry between Alvarez and DeBose was really well done. I loved everything about those two characters, and likewise Zegler does a good job in her duets, and I think her alto voice is perfect for this role. Now both DeBose and Zegler bring real human emotions to the film's somewhat melodramatic plotline, especially toward the end of the film. They give this presence and power that really make the film worth watching. It's really great work by them, and they should both be applauded for it. The problem, of course, is that this is not their film. The main plot of the story is about the men in the story and the racial conflict, and there's only so much you can do with the source material. West Side Story is one of those films that still has an impact to this day. When it was originally released, it was a huge success and became the highest grossing film of 1961. It was nominated for 11 Academy Awards and won 10, including Best Picture, and it became the record holder for the most wins for a musical. It is regarded as one of the greatest greatest musical films of all time. The film has been deemed culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant by the Library of Congress and was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry in 1997. And to be honest here, the original is one of my films in my top 5 for film musical. You just look at how much of an impact it's had. There are beats from the opening riff of America song in the new musical In the Heights. So why recreate the classic now? Well, the original film had a lot of issues when it comes to its depictions of Puerto Ricans. More specifically, look at the brown face that much of the cast wore, along with its fairly over-the-top accents. Rita Moreno, who is Puerto Rican, was given brown face for her role as a Puerto Rican. She, at the time, even questioned the makeup artist, stating that, quote, "We are many colors," end quote. But then the makeup artist basically accused her of being racist. And this film had a lot of white actors playing Puerto Ricans, such as George Chakiris playing Bernardo. Yes, this is how it was back then, and I'm not trying to take away from any of their performances, because some of them are really good. And yes, this is how it was back then, but that doesn't make the problems any better. I will say I do not think that they should go back and obviously remove some of those problems to the original film. It's only about acknowledging them, and that's context of the situation. Unfortunately, at the time, this is just how it was. In 1961, Puerto Ricans were coming to New York after World War II in greater numbers. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, they've been essentially recognized as a particular group of people. And West Side Story, no matter how you look at it, is basically the first and still most influential story about Puerto Ricans, and really telling the world essentially who they are and how they behave and what they look like. So this is why it's somewhat of an issue with how this film represents Puerto Ricans. Even though it is a display of that, it still has stereotypes about Puerto Ricans. Men are gang members and women are either virginal or sexual. And there's also a lot of people at the time who thought that Puerto Ricans were a problem for New York City because they didn't have education, they were more violent, etc. And that's what was going on at the time. And this is then put into West Side Story to somewhat officialize it in a way, not just in the United States, but also globally. And the complexity of this extends further into Rita Moreno as a character, because despite the brown face and the iffiness of some of the song lyrics, she gave a performance and is loved for it. She is, I still think, one of the hugest highlights of this film. And so this new film sought to fix out the issues at hand by doing a remake, and directed by Steven Spielberg. Now, I will say I do question that choice, mostly because Spielberg really hasn't done a musical before. Having said that, he did impress me at times, but more on that in a little bit. This new cast is largely made up of Latin actors, and a lot of them speak Spanish in the film without subtitles. In musicals, there are plenty of remakes of older stories for the new age. People take old source material and provide insight and another perspective on the material. This is what people have done in history of culture. Now, Stephen Sondheim, who wrote the show's original lyrics, said that one of the greatest things about theater is that every time you stage something, you can change it. And you change it basically because you're changing the performer, you're changing the venue, the choreography, the costumes. It's always something that's changing. And so trying to attack some of the problems that the original West Side Story had is going to be difficult. And because this is a story that was initially made in a fairly troubled way, a new perspective would be welcome if they could change it, but also make it a more accurate situation. The problem is that if you do that too much, then people who really love the original will be mad because you change too much of it. So it's really difficult to be authentic to the original while also changing the problems that it had. So with this new film, no matter the changes that they made, it doesn't correct some of the problematic issues that the original had. Of course, obviously, the original was written in the 1950s when cultural authenticity was not a prime concern. And film, as all art is a product of their respective time. Context. So watching the original and knowing the problems of it, and then watching it for what it is not a problem. But when you take the same thing and just change a few aspects of it, such as not using brown face and using people from the right cultural group for the group that you're trying to show on screen, is progress. But it doesn't eliminate the other problems that the film had. because I do believe that the tweaks made to this new rendition were done with care, and the end result does look good, and really good at times. However, film was remade by a filmmaker, screenwriter, and other heads in the filmmaking process who is not of Puerto Rican or Latin descent. That's not to say that if this film was directed by a Puerto Rican, it would be better. More so, it may serve to acknowledge the fact that the plot doesn't really represent the majority of Puerto Rican life, at least on an overarching scale. It still shows old stereotypes where women are either virginal or sexual, and that the men are more violent. But the positive twist on them is that they're all phenomenal dancers. If you ignore the fact of brown face and using the white actors in the original film, the stereotypes are still there. Because in 1961, the idea of Puerto Rican gangs beating up white kids really gave the belief that anyone of that ethnicity were dangerous. Now, I will say that the new version does take time to make them a little bit more sympathetic, such as giving Bernardo this backstory, and then also mentioning that all the sharks are working and they are competent, and the Jets are basically relying on their whiteness to skate by. But it still really emphasizes the idea, and this again goes back to the source material, of even Romeo and Juliet, of this us versus them mentality. And even with that, the film struggles with this to an extent as well. The opening original sequence shows both the sharks and the Jets in this big dance number, whereas this film puts more of the intro focused on the Jets being horrible to the Sharks. The original opening showed them as equals and really made the rivalry more enticing, and additionally, a lot of the recreated numbers just do not have the same level of magic or even epicness that the original does. And again, when you look at films, you're not really supposed to compare it to the original and really make too much of comparisons the problems with the film, because at the end of the day, that becomes preference. The film honestly is a step forward for Latin people of color. Anita even asked that I didn't pick up on initially at one point, that if the reason that Anita and him are not married is because that she's darker than him. However, this comes kind of as a questionable character choice when she tries to push Maria to pick one of her own kind, because there's just a disparity between the two, as they illustrated with that one line of dialogue. Her character does go through a tragic downfall when it comes to she was more pro-America at the beginning, but then becomes more Puerto Rico at the end. But the disparity between that one line of dialogue of questioning the reason for why her and Bernardo are not married versus picking one of her own kind is just kind of conflicting. I know obviously that one of her own kind means Puerto Ricans, but it really just oversimplifies the line of dialogue of colorism and potential races that happen within a community as a whole. But after all that, the biggest problem with this film is Elgert as Tony. Now, there is a supposed age difference between him and Maria, but it really felt significant in this film. Zegler as Maria says she's 18, and that's fairly believable even though she looks 16. However, Elgert looks significantly older, and his foot over Zelker in height is extremely noticeable. Yes, they try to make a point of it and say, oh, you're tall. Their disparity between the two in age and also height really kind of makes it questionable. Given his alleged off-screen problems, it's a little bit problematic to watch him in this role. Now, arguably, it's possible to ignore any off-screen issues if he could sing well, but he's average at best. There were many times where the notes that he was trying to hit weren't hit, and it sounded awful. And this also goes into the lip syncing just in general. Some of the lip syncing in this film were horrific, and I can't believe that they really had that much of an issue getting people to make them look like they're singing. There was multiple times where multiple characters would hold out a note forever, but like just had their mouth open like I was in surprise. And it was so awful that it took me out of the story. Going back to Elgert, doesn't really come off as this hopeless romantic and also a man who wants to be deadly violent. He's a little bit too quote-unquote manly at times and not really romantic in a way, because the original, again, not to compare it too much, but the original really is trying to push the idea of hopeless romance and this theatrical aspect to it. There wasn't that with their chemistry, and it really felt off because of it. So the film really struggles with other details, such as why Tony killed Bernardo. In the original, there's a line of dialogue that he basically did it in self-defense. self-defense. This film shows him wanting to go to the police, and then in the same sequence, Maria sleeps with him. No explanation. Why does Maria have any argument to stay with him? Yes, she loves him, but it's only been a few days. And okay, yes, suspend your disbelief for some of this, but one line of dialogue could have fixed, except instead, in this situation, we now just assume that's the reason because it's love. And yes, that eventually becomes the actual reason for it, but again, given the realistic aspect of this situation of this guy killed your brother, yes, you're in love with him, but no explanation from him that shows why he killed the brother. It doesn't matter who you are. To that decision, and then just to go and sleep with him makes absolutely no sense at all. I grew up with West Side Story, and I love the songs to this day. And honestly, some of the songs in this new rendition had me singing along. I knew the lyrics, it was really nice. And the film does really well when it wants to. And it can be really impactful thanks to Spielberg's experience behind the camera. The issue becomes when one asks, what is the point of this film outside of dollar signs? It's not awful, as I will be listening to Zegler's and DuBose's singing on their version of the songs. However, it's not one that progresses everything in the best way. Yes, they get points for trying, and if this helps create more theater and musical fans in the future, fantastic. The issues with stereotypes on this film will still exist. And in 2022, we really can't use context as the reasoning for this. This is something that should be left in the past instead of only trying to fix the external problems instead of the internal one. The film does succeed with the majority of its characters, the direction, the ending, though not as powerful as the original, but that's a preference, and some of its details and some of its themes. However, it struggles with other portions of its details and its themes. So 4 out of 5. Now this again was the final episode going through the films for the 2021 season. Now in the next episode I will be putting out my predictions for the Oscars and also my top 10 films of the year. You aren't going to want to miss that episode. But before then, what did you think of these films? Let me know. Hit me up on social media.
The Formal Review is on Facebook, Twitter, and the Gram, and also YouTube. The handle's all the same. It's at The Formal Review. And for anyone who has supported me on a financial basis, I thank you very much for supporting me in that way. For anyone who wants to support, you can go to anchor.fm/The Formal Review. Click support this podcast, and any donation is appreciated. Thank you all again for tuning in. And until next time,
If you're able to, get vaccinated.
and I'll see you at the movies.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Formal Review. Cheers, and we'll see you next time.